Italian Seconda Pia took the first photograph.
When Secondo Pia makes this photograph, he almost dropped the plate. It scared him because he said, "My God, I was looking into the face of the Lord." That's when he realized that the image on the cloth is a negative. The lights and darks are reversed from what we're used to seeing.
For the first time, people could clearly see the body on the shroud as a positive image. The photograph displayed details that were invisible to the naked eye. It triggered an uproar.
He's immediately accused of fraud, immediately accused of cheating, lying, and manipulating this. It's a fake. And it wasn't until 1931 when Giuseppe Henriet is allowed to photograph the shroud for the second time, gets the same results, of course. The world of science suddenly looks at the shroud and says, well, wait a minute, maybe we should look at this closer.
By the 1970s, the Turin shroud was world famous. Many believed it was the burial shroud of Jesus, and yet scientists hadn't been able to examine it. And as the 20th century progressed, new technology was set to reveal even more detailed images of the face in astonishing 3D. One breakthrough was made using a remarkable new imaging device. The VP8 was originally designed to analyze aerial photographs. It converts the light and dark on a traditional two-dimensional image to create a brightness map displayed on a 3D grid. Scientists wondered if it could be used to shed new light on the shroud. Engineer Peter Schumacher helped develop the VP8.
Nobody in our company had ever even heard of the Shroud of Turin, let alone seen pictures or wanted to look at image analysis of the Shroud of Turin.
When Schumacher placed an ordinary photograph under the machine, it displayed levels of brightness, but revealed no 3D data. This is how every photo appeared. The machine couldn't decipher real height and depth to display a true 3D image. But when an image of the shroud was placed under the device, something remarkable happened.
All of a sudden, we're seeing contrast that has something to do with height and depth, real distance. The nose has a prominence, the cheeks roll off, the hair has a shape to it and is rounded. The whole image has dimension to it.
The results suggested that the shroud image could have been created by a real human body. Armed with these results and keen to find out more, a group of scientists formed the Shroud of Turin research project. They lobbied church authorities for permission to analyze the shroud. In the 14th century, a shroud appeared in the French town of Liry. People claimed it was Christ's. If the shroud was real, this fragile piece of cloth has survived 2,000 years. But the shroud had its share of misfortune. Fire nearly destroyed it in 1532, and water stained the image. Nuns repaired the shroud and attached a protective backing cloth. On the 8th of October 1978, in the Italian city of Turin, an unprecedented event took place. For the first time, the church allowed scientists to examine the Shroud of Turin, one of the most mysterious objects in the Western world. For 120 hours, the Shroud of Turin research project ran thousands of tests on this 14-foot piece of linen, believed by many to be the sacred burial shroud of Jesus Christ.
We opened up Pandora's box and created a whole new group of questions.
One of the leading members of the team was Ray Rogers. a highly respected chemist from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Rogers was a man of science, not God, but he was intrigued by the shroud. It harbored great mysteries that he wanted to solve.
My primary field is thermochemistry. I look at the effects of heat on materials. And here were these scorches on this cloth. I was asked, can I determine whether or not it was painted? There wasn't any painting material there of any kind. And even more important than that to me was that they dumped water on it to put out the fire. Nothing in the image moved with the water. You know, that's rather staggering because at one fell swoop that pretty much eliminates almost everything that could have been used to paint the image.
One of the major components of linen is cellulose. And what we see on the surface of that darkness that gives rise to the image is in fact degraded cellulose. It's not a pigment.
Next, the scientists looked at areas where the image displayed bleeding wounds and made a stunning discovery. The chemical signature of real blood. The team had discovered a powerful connection to the crucifixion.
My area was mechanism, manner, and cause of death, and type of suffering the individual had.
Since 1948, Dr. Zagaby has been investigating the shroud to answer a fundamental question. Does the evidence on the shroud match up with a person who died by crucifixion? Dr. Zagaby's tests and the photographic evidence matched up. The victim on the shroud had been crucified. But was it Jesus Christ or a medieval man? To answer this crucial question, scientists had to find out how old the shroud was. In 1988, scientists lobbied for permission to take a sample of cloth for carbon dating.
I was in Rome at the time, and there was this real tension, this real controversy as to whether this should be subjected to these scientific tests. I mean, if this is the burial shroud of Jesus, is that not an indignity to what is the only physical link to the Savior? And others would say, well, look, if this is a fraud, we need to know one way or another. And John Paul II, to his credit, and the Vatican, to its credit, said, no, we're going to put this to the knife, literally.
Unknown to them, Pope John Paul II was already consulting his own scientific advisors and had reached a decision. It was a historic decision. Scientists were finally given permission to carbon date the shroud. For this test, the sample would have to be burnt. Permanently destroying a piece of the shroud was a highly controversial action. The church authorities imposed strict conditions on the scientists, only allowing a small sample to be cut from a damaged corner of the shroud.
It was a convenient choice. It was in an area of a cloth that nobody was going to complain about. Nobody was going to take issue with the fact that they're pulling threads from the more pristine parts of the cloth.
The section removed from the damaged corner was divided into 4. One piece was sent to Oxford University, another to the Swiss Institute of Technology in Zurich, and 2 smaller pieces were sent to the University of Arizona. The result was a stunning revelation, making headlines around the world.
The Shroud of Turin turned out to be a medieval sample from the 14th century, and that's what the radiocarbon date shows.
Carbon dating exposed it as a medieval fake.
We knew that it wouldn't be 2,000 years old after 5 minutes.
The Shroud of Turin could not be the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Despite the evidence, many of the faithful refused to accept the carbon dating results. Their belief in the shroud was unshakable.
Here you have the most studied artifact in human history, and science still can't give us an answer.
By 1988, The Turin Shroud was the most controversial relic in the Christian world. Carbon dating had concluded that it was a 14th century fake and not the burial shroud of Jesus. But scientific tests also concluded that the image wasn't painted, and the cloth contained the chemical components of real blood. As a result, the faithful still believed that the shroud could be genuine, and the carbon dating flawed. In the remote mountains of Panama, one shroud believer's obsession was about to spark renewed interest in the shroud.
I got the idea that there was holographic information in the Shroud of Turin. So what we have in the computer now is the face of Jesus Christ in 3 dimensions.
Publication of the image ignited fresh interest in the shroud, but it didn't prove the linen cloth was genuine. Shroud believers had to embrace scientific methods if they were to have any hope of challenging the carbon dating result. And in the United States in 2000, 2 people did just that. Sue Benford and her husband Joe Marino believed the shroud was real.
I'd never heard of the shroud before 1997. I was flipping channels and saw the face on the TV. And there was something very knowing that I had, that was really Jesus' face.
This vision inspired Benford and her husband to find proof that the carbon dating results were wrong. Neither of them were professional scientists, but they thought they'd found a vital clue, which proved the carbon dating was flawed.
Look here. Nowhere else is there this definitive, intentional dark green.
While checking images taken in 1978, Benford noticed something strange about the piece of shroud chosen for the carbon dating samples. The herringbone pattern that is so consistent elsewhere in the cloth looked misaligned.
Our theory is that there's a mixture of 16th century cloth and 1st century cloth, and the data that we're finding on the cloth matches that theory.
Benford and Marino believed that the carbon date was wrong because the section chosen for the samples was contaminated with later material.
I'm skeptical when I'm listening to this, but they had taken photographs that were available of the samples taken for the carbon dating, and they had submitted these to several textile experts who didn't know they were looking at a photograph from the shroud, and each of these textile experts, independent of each other, said, you know, this looks rewoven.
Benford and Marino argued that because the carbon dating sample contained material from both the 16th and 1st centuries, the result was in between the two. In 2000, Benford and Marino published a paper claiming that medieval cotton was introduced into the damaged corner of the linen shroud. Their claims were immediately dismissed by the scientific community. One scientist in particular was outraged. Ray Rogers, a member of the team that conducted the first scientific investigation, had always kept an open mind about the shroud. But as a man of science, he was furious that the shroud believers started questioning the carbon dating evidence.
I had given up on the shroud, and this was about the same time that the lunatic fringe were coming up with an infinite number of ways the date could be wrong, and this was just the last straw.
I got a call from Ray, and he goes, "What the hell is this? This is nonsense. I can prove these people wrong in 5 minutes." And I said, "Well, Ray, go for it." One of the things Ray had a problem with was the fact these weren't scientists, and he didn't take them very seriously.
I think he lumped us in with the lunatic friend at that time, and probably for many times beyond that.
He was the gunfighter. He was one of those guys that if he didn't like what you were saying, he'd have pulled out his 6-shooter and fired off 6 before he had a chance to take a breath. He was not very tolerant, especially of people doing bad science.
By 2005, the scientific mainstream thought they'd laid the mystery of the Turin Shroud to rest. It was a fake, dated between 1260 and 1390. The carbon dating process destroyed the sample, but all the labs involved in the 1988 test kept parts of their sample in reserve. Rogers was in a unique position to confirm if the linen shroud contained later cotton repairs.
Ray had in his possession, from 1978, the tape samples lifted from the surface of the shroud. But remember, those were not big fibers, those were fibrils taken from the surface. He also had some samples that were taken from the shroud by Professor Reyes, who took samples in 1973 from a corner that was immediately adjacent to the area taken for carbon dating.
But Ray Rogers was in a race against time. He was fighting a losing battle with cancer, and he knew his end was near. His old friend Barry Schwartz was determined that Rogers should have the chance to speak from beyond the grave.
I am Ray Rogers, Raymond N. Rogers, and I've been working on the shroud since 1977.
He filmed a detailed interview with Rogers so that the dying scientist could put on the record exactly what he found.
So I read their paper and I thought, I've got the samples that can shoot that full of holes. So I got out the Ross samples and I got out the shroud samples, and I went to work again.
A couple hours later, he calls me and he goes, "Boy," he says, "I can't believe it." He says, "They were right. There's cotton here." He says, "There's no cotton in the rest of the shroud, but there's cotton interwoven here. They must be right."
No one was more shocked than Rogers. His observations seemed to confirm Benford and Marino's theory. The original linen shroud contained additional cotton threads. He needed to examine the threads that were carbon dated.
Until I could get a sample from the real radiocarbon cloth, a documented sample, I couldn't prove anything. The authentic radiocarbon sample that I got, these segments of yarn were cut from the middle of the radiocarbon sample, so there was no question about them. And when I looked at these samples from the radiocarbon area, there's no problem at all finding cotton in them.
Rogers was now convinced that Benford and Marino were right. And he found other evidence they had missed. He knew from his own tests in 1978 that the shroud was free of artificial dyes and pigments.
The only thing in the shroud that was dyed or stained was this radiocarbon area. So my hypothesis at the moment is that this was done on purpose to fool your eye.
This was further evidence that the shroud was repaired with cotton in exactly the area where the carbon dating sample was taken.
And when we went back and looked at the ultraviolet photographs, here is this area that's significantly darker. It doesn't fluoresce as much, and it's just this area that, around the Ross sample and where the radiocarbon sample was cut. And if they had looked at any of the photographs that we had and studied the information we had as of 1978, they would have known that that was the worst possible place they could have taken a sample. I'm coming to the conclusion that it has a very good chance of being the piece of cloth that was used to bury the historic Jesus.
He writes a paper that's accepted for publication in Thermochemica Acta, January of 2005. And that paper is the only peer-reviewed science that challenges the carbon date with anything credible up until that point in time.
Rogers knew that his findings needed to be tested with more sophisticated equipment. So he contacted a colleague who still worked at Los Alamos Laboratory, Bob Villarreal.
It was a race for him because he knew he was dying. He wanted to know, is this corner of the shroud of the same composition, whether it was flax or linen or cotton? If it was cotton, it's not the same as the main shroud cloth, which is linen.
Rogers would never live to discover the answer. He lost his long battle with cancer on the 8th of March, 2005. He was 78 years old. After Ray's death, Bob Villarreal was determined to honor his promise. He passed the fibers to a specialist, and something remarkable happened.
I received a call from him and he said, the thread that I was going to analyze broke into 2 pieces. Is God going to be mad at me?
Just as Rogers suspected, the threads appeared to be 2 pieces of cotton and linen woven together. In 2008, the findings were announced to the world. They supported the theory that the carbon dating sample was poorly chosen, as Rogers suggested in his final interview.
The shroud is a very unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. 3-dimensional relief, the front and the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I've never heard of a way to make it. Just the Shroud of Turin.